American Gods, a novel by Neil Gaiman. Part 1, Shadows. Chapter 1. The boundaries of our country, sir? Why, sir, on to the north we are bounded by the aurora borealis. On the east we are bounded by the rising sun. On the south we are bounded by the precession of the equinoxes. And on the west by the day of judgment. The American. Joe Miller's last book. Shadow had done 3 years in prison. He was big enough, and he looked don't fuck with me enough, that his biggest problem was killing time. So he kept himself in shape and taught himself to do coin tricks and thought a lot about how much he loved his wife. The best thing, in Shadow's opinion, perhaps the only good thing, about being in prison was a feeling of relief. The feeling that he'd plunged as low as he could plunge and he'd hit bottom. He didn't worry that the man was going to get him, because the man had got him. He did not awake in prison with a feeling of dread, for he was no longer scared of what tomorrow might bring, because yesterday had brought it. It did not matter, Shadow decided, if you had done what you had been convicted of or not. In his experience, everyone he met in prison was aggrieved about something. There was always something the authorities had got wrong. Something they said that you did when you didn't. Or you didn't quite do they said what you did. What was important was that he had got you. He had noticed it in the first few days when everything from slang to the bad food was new. Despite the misery and utter skin-crawling horror of incarceration, he was breathing relief. Shadow tried not to talk too much. Somewhere around the middle of year 2, he mentioned his theory to Low-Key Lysmith, his cellmate. Low-Key, who was a grifter from Minnesota, smiled his scarred smile. "Yeah," he said, "that's true. It's even better when you've been sentenced to death. That's when you remember the jokes about the guys who kicked their boots off as the noose flipped around their necks, because their friends had always told them they'd die with their boots on." "Is that a joke?" asked Shadow. "Damn right. Gallows humor. Best kind there is. Bang! The worst has happened. You get a few days for it to sink in, then you're riding the cart on your way to do the dance onto nothing." "When did they last hang a man in this state?" asked Shadow. "How the hell should I know?" Lysmith kept his orange-blonde hair pretty much shaved. You could see the lines of his skull. "Tell you what, though. This country started going to hell when they stopped hanging folks. No gallows dirt, no gallows deals." Shadow shrugged. He could see nothing romantic in a death sentence. If you didn't have a death sentence, he decided, then prison was, at best, only a temporary reprieve from life, for 2 reasons. First, life creeps back into prison. There are always places to go further down, even when you've been taken off of the board. Life goes on, even if it's life under a microscope or in a cage. And second, if you just hang in there, someday they're going to have to let you out. In the beginning, it was too far away for Shadow to focus on. Then it became a distant beam of hope, and he learned how to tell himself this too shall pass, when the prison shit went down, as prison shit always did. One day, the magic door would open and he'd walk through it. So he marked off the days on his Songbirds of North America calendar, which was the only calendar they sold in the prison commissary, and the sun went down, and he didn't see it, and the sun came up, and he didn't see it. He practiced coin tricks from a book he found in the wasteland of the prison library, and he worked out, and he made lists in his head of what he'd do when he got out of prison. Shadow's lists got shorter and shorter. After 2 years, he had it down to 3 things. First, he was going to take a bath. A real, long, serious soak in a tub with bubbles in it. Maybe read the paper. Maybe not. Some days he thought one way, some days the other. Second, he was going to towel himself off, put on a robe, maybe slippers. He liked the idea of slippers. If he smoked, he would be smoking a pipe about now. But he didn't smoke. He would pick up his wife in his arms. "Puppy," she would squeal in mock horror and real delight. "What are you doing?" He would carry her into the bedroom and close the door. They'd call it for pizza as if they got hungry. Third, after he and Laura had come out of the bedroom, maybe a couple of days later, He was going to keep his head down and stay out of trouble for the rest of his life. "And then you'll be happy?" asked low-key Lysmith. That day they were working in the prison shop, assembling bird feeders, which was barely more interesting than stamping out license plates. "Call no man happy," said Shadow, "until he is dead." "Herodotus," said Loki. "Hey, you're learning." "Who the fuck's Herodotus?" asked the Iceman, slotting together the sides of a bird feeder and passing it to Shadow, who bolted and screwed it tight. "Dead Greek," said Shadow. "My last girlfriend was Greek, same size and shape as a Coke machine, with some blue eyes and hair so blonde it almost came out white. He had beaten the crap out of some guy who made the mistake of copying a feel off his girlfriend in the bar where she danced, and the Iceman bounced. The guy's friends had called the police, who arrested the Iceman and ran a check on him, which revealed that the Iceman had walked from a work release program 18 months earlier. "So what was I supposed to do?" asked the Iceman, aggrieved, when he told Shadow the whole sad tale. "I told him that she was my girlfriend. What was I supposed to do? Was I supposed to let him disrespect me like that? Was I? I mean, he had his hands all over her." Shadow said something meaningless like, "You tell him," and left him at that. One thing he had learned early: you do your own time in prison. You don't do anyone else's time for them. Keep your head down. Do your time. Lysmith had loaned Shadow a battered paperback copy of Herodotus' Histories several months earlier. "It's not boring. It's cool," he said. When Shadow protested that he didn't read books, "Read it first, then tell me it's cool." Shadow made a face, but he had started to read, and he'd found himself hooked against his will. "Greeks," said the Iceman with disgust. "If it ain't true that what they say about him either. I tried giving it to my girlfriend in the ass, and she almost clawed my eyes out." Lysmith was transferred one day, without warning. He left Shadow his copy of Herodotus, with several actual coins hitting on the pages. 2 quarters, a penny, and a nickel. Coins were contraband. You can sharpen the edges against a stone, slice someone's face in a fight. Shadow didn't want a weapon. Shadow just wanted something to do with his hands. Shadow was not superstitious. He did not believe in anything he could not see. Still, he could feel disaster hovering above the prison in those final weeks. Just as he had felt in the days before the robbery, it was simply a fear of going back to the world outside. He could not be sure. He was more paranoid than usual, and in prison, usual is very, and a survival skill. Shadow became more quiet, more shadowy than ever. He found himself watching the body language of the guards, of the other inmates, searching for a clue to the bad things that was going to happen. And he was certain that it would. A month before he was due to be released, Shadow sat in a chilly office, facing a short man with a pork wine birthmark on his forehead. They sat on a desk across from each other. The man had Shadow's file open in front of him and was holding a ballpoint pen. The end of the pen was badly chewed. "You cold, Shadow?" "Yes," Shadow said. "A little." The man shrugged. "That's the system. Furnaces don't go on until December the 1st. They go off March the 1st. I don't make the rules." Social niceties done with, he ran his forefinger down the sheet of paper stapled to the inside left of the folder. "You're 32 years old?" "Yes, sir." "You look younger." "Clean living." "Says here you've been a model inmate." "I learned my lesson, sir." "Did you? Did you really?" He looked at Shadow intently, the birthmark on his forehead lowering. Shadow thought about telling the man some of the theories about prison, but he said nothing. He nodded instead, and concentrated on appearing properly remorseful. "Says you've got a wife. Laura." "Yes." "How's everything there?" "Pretty good. She kinda got mad at me when I got incarcerated, but she's come down to see me as much as she could. It's a long way to travel. We write, and I call her when I can." "So what does your wife do?" "She's a travel agent. Sends people all over the world." "How'd you meet her?" Shadow could not decide why the man was asking. He considered telling him it was none of his business. Then said, "She was my best buddy's friend's best wife. They set us up on a blind date. We hit it off. We've got a job waiting for you." "Yes, sir. My buddy Robbie, the one I told you about, he owns the mussel farm, the place I used to train. He says my old job is waiting for me." "Really?" the man said with his eyebrow raised. "Says he figures I'll be a big draw. Bring back some old-timers and pull in the tough crowd who want to be tougher." The man seemed satisfied. He chewed the end of his ballpoint pen, then turned over the sheet of paper. "How do you feel about your offense?" Shadow shrugged. I was stupid, he said, and he meant it. The man with the birthmark sighed, then he ticked off a number of items on a checklist. He rifled through the papers on Shadow's file. How are you getting home from here? He asked. Greyhound? Flying home. It's a good time to have a wife who's a travel agent. The man frowned after the birthmark creased. She sent you a ticket. Didn't need to. Just sent me a confirmation number. Electronic ticket. All I have to do is turn up at the airport in a month and show my ID, and I'm out of here. The man nodded, scribbled one final note, then he closed the file and put down the ballpoint pen. Two pale hands rested on the gray desk like pink animals. He brought his hands close together, made a steeple of his forefingers, and stared at Shadow with watery hazel eyes. You're lucky, he said. You have someone to go back to. You got a job waiting. You can put all this behind you. You got a second chance. Make the most of it. The man did not offer to shake Shadow's hand as he rose to leave, nor did Shadow expect him to. The last week was the worst. In some ways, it was worse than the whole 3 years put together. Shadow wondered if it was the weather, oppressive, still, and cold. It felt as if a storm was on the way, but the storm never came. He had the jitters and the heebie-jeebies, a feeling deep in his stomach that something was certainly wrong. In the exercise yard, the wind gusted. Shadow imagined that he could smell snow on the air. He called his wife Collect. Shadow knew the phone companies whacked a $3 surcharge on every call made from a prison phone. That's why operators are always so real polite to people calling from prisons. Shadow had decided they knew that he paid their wages. Something feels weird, he told Laura. That wasn't the first thing he said to her. The first thing he said was, I love you. Because it's a good thing to say if you mean it. And Shadow did. Hello, said Laura. I love you too. What feels weird? I don't know, he said. Maybe the weather. It feels like if we could only get a storm, everything would be okay. It's nice here, she said. The last of the leaves haven't quite fallen. If we don't get a storm, you'll be able to see them when you get home. 5 days, said Shadow. 120 hours, and then you come home, she said. Everything okay there? Nothing wrong? Everything's fine. I'm seeing Robbie tonight. We're planning your welcome home surprise party. Surprise party? Of course. You don't know anything about it, do you? Not a thing. That's my husband, she said. Shadow realized that he was smiling. He had been inside for 3 years, but she could still make him smile. Love you, babes. Love you, puppy, said Shadow. Shadow put down the phone. When they got married, Laura told Shadow she wanted a puppy, but their landlord pointed out they weren't allowed pets under the terms of their lease. Hey, Shadow said, I'll be your puppy. What do you want me to do? Chew your slippers, piss on the kitchen floor, lick your nose, sniff your crotch? I bet there's nothing a puppy can do that I can't do. And he picked her up, and she weighed nothing at all, and began to lick her nose while she giggled and shrieked, and he carried her to the bed. In the food hall, Sam Fetisher slided over to Shadow and smiled, showing his old teeth. He sat down beside Shadow and began to eat his macaroni and cheese. We gotta talk, said Sam Fetisher. Sam Fetisher was one of the blackest men that Shadow had ever seen. He might have been 60, he might have been 80. Then again, Shadow had met 30-year-old crackheads who looked older than Sam Fetisher. Huh? Said Shadow. Storm's on the way, said Jim. Feels like it, said Shadow. Maybe it'll snow soon. Not that kind of storm. Bigger storms than that coming, I tell you, boy. You better be off in here out on the street when the big storm comes. Done my time, said Shadow. Friday, I'm gone. Sam Fetisher stared at Shadow. Where you from, he asked. Eagle Point, Indiana. You're a lying fuck, said Sam Fetisher. I mean originally. Where are your folks from? Chicago, said Shadow. His mother lived in Chicago as a girl, and she had died there half a lifetime ago. Like I said, big storm coming. Keep your head down, Shadow boy. It's like, what do they call those things continents ride around on? Some kind of plates? Tectonic plates? Shadow hazarded. That's it, tectonic plates. It's like when they go riding, when North America goes skidding into South America, you don't want to be in the middle, you dig me? Not even a little. One brown eye closed in a slow wink. Hell, don't say I didn't warn you, said Sam Fetisher. He spooned around a trembling lump of orange jello into his mouth. Shadow spent half the night awake, drifting in and out of sleep, listening to his new cellmate grunt and snore in the bunk below him. Several cells away, a man whined and howled and sobbed like an animal, and from time to time, Someone would scream out for him to shut the fuck up. Shadow tried not to hear. He let the empty minutes wash over him, lonely and slow. 2 days, 48 hours, starting with oatmeal and prison coffee, and a guard named Wilson who tapped Shadow harder than he had to on the shoulder and said, "Shadow, this way." Shadow checked his conscience. It was quiet, which did not, he had observed, in a prison, mean that he was not in deep shit. They walked more or less side by side, feet echoing on metal and concrete. Shadow tasted fear in the back of his throat, bitter as old coffee. The bad thing was happening. There was a voice in the back of his head whispering that they were going to slap another year onto his sentence, drop him into solitary, cut off his hands, cut off his head. He told himself he was being stupid. His heart was pounding fit to burst out of his chest. "I don't get you, Shadow," Wilson said as they walked. "What's not to get, sir?" "You. You're too fucking quiet. Too polite. You wait like the old guys, but you're what? 25, 28? 32, sir. And what are you? A spick, a gypsy?" Not that I know of, sir. Maybe. Maybe you got some dark blood in you." "You got dark blood in you, Shadow?" "Could be, sir." Shadow stood tall and looked straight ahead and concentrated on not allowing himself to be riled by this man. "Yeah? Well, all I know is you fucking spook me." Wilson had sandy blonde hair and a sandy blonde face and a sandy blonde smile. "You leaving us soon?" "Hope so, sir." "You'll be back. I can see it in your eyes. You're a fuck-up, Shadow. Now, if I had my way, none of you assholes would ever get out. We'd drop you in the hole and forget about you." "Wable," thought Shadow, and he said nothing. It was a survival thing. He didn't answer back. Didn't say anything about his job security for prison guards, debate the nature of repentance, rehabilitation, or rates of recidivism. He didn't say anything funny or clever, and to be on the safe side, when he was talking to a prison official whenever possible, he didn't say anything at all. Speak when you're spoken to. Do your own time, get out, get home, have a long hot bath, tell Laura you love her, rebuild a life. They walked through a couple of checkpoints. Wilson showed his ID each time. Up a set of stairs, and they were standing outside the prison warden's office. Shadow had never been there before, but he knew what it was. It had the prison warden's name, G. Patterson, on the door in black letters, and beside the door, a miniature traffic light. The top light burned red. Wilson pressed a button below the traffic light. There they stood in silence for a couple of minutes. Shadow tried to tell himself everything was all right, that on Friday morning he'd be on the plane to Eagle Point, but he did not believe himself. The red light went out, and the green light went on, and Wilson opened the door. They went inside. Shadow had seen the warden a handful of times in the last 3 years. Once he'd been showing a politician around. Shadow had not recognized the man. Once, during a lockdown, the warden had spoken to them in a group of 100, telling them that the prison was overcrowded and that since it would remain overcrowded, they had better get used to it. This was Shadow's first time up close to the man. Up close, Patterson looked worse. His face was oblong with gray hair cut into a military bristle cut. He smelled of Old Spice. Behind him was a shelf of books, each with the word prison in the title. His desk was perfectly clean, empty, but for a telephone and a few tear-off pages, far-side calendars. He had a hearing aid in his right ear. "Please, sit down." Shadow sat down at the desk, noting the civility. Wilson stood behind him. The warden opened a desk drawer and took out a file, placed it on his desk. "Says here you were sentenced to 6 years for aggravated assault and battery. You've served 3. You were due to be released on Friday." "Were?" Shadow felt his stomach lurch inside him. He wondered how much longer he was going to have to serve. Another year? 2 years? All 3? All he said was, "Yes, sir." The warden licked his lips. "What did you say?" I said, "Yes, sir." "Shadow, we're going to be releasing you later this afternoon. You'll be getting out a couple of days early." The warden said with no joy, as if he were intoning a death sentence. Shadow nodded, and he waited for the other shoe to drop. The warden looked at the paper on his desk. "This came from the Johnson Memorial Hospital in Eagle Point. Your wife. She died in the early hours of this morning. It was an automobile accident. I'm sorry." Shadow nodded once more. Wilson walked him back to his cell, not saying anything. He unlocked the door and let Shadow in. Then he said, "It's like one of them good news, bad news jokes, isn't it? Good news, we're letting you out early. Bad news, your wife is dead." He laughed, as if it were genuinely funny. Shadow said nothing at all. Numbly, he packed up his possessions, gave several away. He left behind Low-Key's Herodotus book and the Book of Coin Tricks with a momentary pang. He abandoned the blank metal discs he had smuggled out of the workshop, which had, until he found Low-Key's change in the book, served him for coins. There were coins, real coins, on the outside. He shaved, dressed in civilian clothes, and he walked through the door after door, knowing he would never walk back through them again, feeling empty inside. The rain had started to gust from the gray sky, a freezing rain. Pellets of ice stung Shadow's face, while the rain soaked the overcoat as they walked away from the prison building toward the yellow ex-school bus that would take them to the nearest city. By the time they got to the bus, they were soaked. 8 of them were leaving, Shadow thought. 1,500 still inside. He sat on the bus and shivered from the heaters until the heater started working, wondering if he was where he was going now. Ghost images filled his head, unbidden. In his imagination, he was leaving another prison. Long ago. He had been in prison for the lightless garret room for far too long. His beard was wild and his hair was a tangle. The guards had walked him down a gray stone stairway and into a plaza filled with brightly colored things, with people and with objects. It was a market day, and he was dazzled by the noise and the colors squirming at the sunlight and filled the square, smelling the salt wet air and all the good things of the market, and he left the sun glittered from the water. The bus shuddered to a halt at a red light. The wind howled around the bus, and the wipers swooshed heavily back and forth across the windshield, smearing into the city into a red and yellow neon wetness. It was early afternoon, but it looked like night through the glass. "Shit," said the man behind Shadow, rubbing the condensation from the window with his hand. A wet figure hurrying down the sidewalk. "There's pussy out there." Shadow swallowed. It occurred to him that he had not cried yet. Had in fact felt nothing at all. No tears, no sorrow, nothing. He found himself thinking about a guy named Johnny Larch he'd shared a cell with when he'd first been inside, who told Shadow how he'd once got out after 5 years behind bars with $100 and a ticket to Seattle where his sister lived. Johnny Larch had gone to the airport, and he handed the ticket to the woman on the counter, and she asked to see his driver's license. He showed it to her. It expired a couple years earlier. She told him it was not valid as ID. He told her it might not be valid as a driver's license, but it sure as hell was fine identification. It had a photo of him on it, and his height, and his weight, damn it. Who else did she think he was, if it wasn't him? She said she'd thank him to keep his voice down. He told her to give him a fucking boarding pass, or she was going to regret it. And that wasn't going to be disrespected. You don't let people disrespect you in prison. Then she pressed a button, and a few minutes later, airport security showed up, and they tried to persuade Johnny Larch to leave the airport quietly, which he did not leave, and there was something of an altercation. The upshot of it all was that Johnny Larch actually never made it to Seattle, and he spent the next couple days in the town in bars. His $100 was gone. He held up a gas station with a toy gun for money to keep drinking, and the police finally picked him up for pissing in the street. Pretty soon, he was back inside serving the rest of his sentence and a little extra for the gas station job. And the moral of this story, according to Johnny Larch, was this: don't piss off people who work in airports. Are you sure it's not something like kinds of behavior that work in a specialized environment such as prison can fail to work and in fact become harmful when used outside of such an environment? Said Shadow. When Johnny Larch told him the story, "No, listen to me. I'm telling you, man. Don't piss off those bitches in airports." Shadow half smiles at the memory. His own driver's license several months to go before it expired. "Bus station! Everybody out!" The building stank of piss and sour beer. Shadow climbed into a taxi and told the driver to take him to the airport. Told him that there was an extra $5 if he could do it in silence. They made it in 20 minutes, and the driver never said a word. Then Shadow was stumbling through the brightly lit airport terminal. Shadow worried about the whole e-ticket business. He knew he had a ticket for a flight on Friday, but he didn't know if it would work today. Anything electronic seemed fundamentally magical to Shadow, and liable to evaporate at any moment. He liked things he could hold and touch. Still, in his wallet, back in his possession for the first time in 3 years, containing several expired credit cards and one Visa card, which he was pleasantly surprised to discover didn't expire to the end of January. He had a reservation number, and he realized he had certainly that once he got home, everything would somehow be all right. Once more, Laura would be fine again. Maybe it would be some kind of scam to spring him a few days early. Maybe it was a simple mix-up. Some other Laura Moon's body had been dragged from the highway wreckage. Lightning flickered across the airport through the window sills. Shadow realized he was holding his breath, waiting for something. A distant boom of thunder? He exulted. A white-haired woman stared at him from behind the bar. "Hello," said Shadow. "You're the first strange woman I've spoken to in flesh in 3 years. I've got an e-ticket number. I was supposed to be traveling on Friday, but I have to go today. There was a death in the family." "I'm sorry to hear that." She tapped at the keyboard, looked at the screen, and tapped again. "No problem. I've put you here on the 3:30. It may be delayed because of the storm, so keep an eye on the screens. Checking any baggage?" He held up a shoulder bag. "I don't need to check this, do I?" "No," she said. "It's fine. Do you have any picture ID?" Shadow showed her his driver's license, then she assured her that no one had given him a bomb to take into the plane, and she, in return, gave him a printed boarding pass. Then he paused and went through the metal detector while his bag went through the x-ray machine. It was not a big airport, but the number of people just wandering, amazed him. He watched people put down bags casually, observed wallets stuffed into back pockets, saw purses put down, unwatched, under chairs. That was when he realized he was no longer in prison. 30 minutes to wait until boarding. Shadow bought a slice of pizza and burned his lip on the hot cheese. He took his change and went to the phones. Called Robbie at the mussel farm, but the machine answered. "Hey, Robbie. They tell me Laura's dead," Shadow said. "They let me out early. I'm coming home." Then, because people do make mistakes, he'd seen it happen, he called home and listened to Laura's voice. "Hi," she said. "I'm not here and I can't come to the phone. Leave a message and I'll get back to you. And have a good day." Shadow couldn't bring himself to leave a message. He sat in a plastic chair by the gate and held his bag so tight it hurt his hand. He was thinking about the first time he had ever seen Laura. He hadn't even known her name then. She was Aubrey Burton's best friend. She had been sitting with Robbie in a booth at Chi-Chi's talking about something. Probably about how one of the other trainers had announced she was opening her own dance studio while Laura had walked in a pace or so behind Audrey, and Shadow had found himself staring. She had long chestnut hair and eyes so blue Shadow mistakenly thought she was wearing tinted contact lenses. She ordered a strawberry daiquiri and insisted that Shadow taste it, and laughed delightedly when he did. Laura loved to taste what people had tasted. He had kissed her good night that night. She tasted the strawberry daiquiris, and he never wanted to kiss anyone else again. A woman announced that his plane was boarding, and Shadow's row was the first to be called. He was in the very back, an empty seat beside him. The rain pattered constantly against the side of the plane. He imagined small children tossing down dried peas by the handful from the skies. As the plane took off, he fell asleep. Shadow was in a dark place, and the thing staring at him wore a buffalo's head, rank and furry with huge wet eyes. Its body was a man's body, oiled and slick. "Changes are coming," said the buffalo without moving its lips. "There are certain decisions that you will have to make." Firelight flickered down from the wet cave walls. "Where am I?" "In the earth, under the earth," said the buffalo man. "You are where the forgotten wait." His eyes were liquid black marbles, and his voice was a rumble from beneath the world. He smelled like wet cow. "Believe," said the rumbling voice. "If you were to survive, you must believe." "Believe what?" said Shadow. "What should I believe?" He stared at Shadow, the buffalo man, and he drew himself up huge, and his eyes filled with fire. He opened his spit-flecked buffalo mouth, and it was red inside with the flames that burned inside him under the earth. "Everything!" roared the buffalo man. The world tipped and spun, and Shadow was on the plane once more, but the tipping continued. In the front of the plane, a woman screamed half-heartedly. Lightning burst and blinding flashes around the plane. The captain came on the intercom to tell them he was going to try and gain some altitude to get away from the storm. The plane shook and shuddered, and Shadow wondered coldly and idly if he was going to die. It seemed possible, he decided, but unlikely. He stared out of the window and watched the lightning illuminate the horizon. He dozed once more and dreamed he was back in prison, and low-key had whispered him in the food line that someone had put out a contract on his life, but that Shadow could not find out who or why, and when he woke up, they were coming in for a landing. He stumbled off the plane, blinking and waking. All airports, he had decided, look very much the same. It didn't actually matter where you were. You are in an airport. Tiles and walkways and restrooms, gates and newsstands and fluorescent lights. This airport looked like an airport. The trouble was, this wasn't the airport he was going to. This was a big airport, with way too many people and way too many gates. The people had gazed. Beaten look you only see in airports. Hell. If hell is other people, thought Shadow, then purgatory is airports. Excuse me, ma'am. The woman looked at him over the clipboard. Yes. What airport is this? She looked at him puzzled, trying to decide whether or not he was joking, and then she said, St. Louis. I thought this was the plane to Eagle Point. It was. They redirected here because of the storms. Didn't they make an announcement? Probably. I fell asleep. You'll need to talk to that man over there in the red coat. The man was almost as tall as Shadow. He looked like the father from a 70s sitcom. He tapped something into a computer and told Shadow to run to a gate to the far side of the terminal. Shadow ran through the airport, but the doors were already closed when he got to the gate. He watched the plane pull away from the gate through the plate glass. Then he explained his problem to the gate attendant calmly, quietly, politely, and she sent him to a passenger assistance desk where Shadow explained that he was on his way home after a long absence and his wife had just been killed in a road accident and that it was vitally important that he went home now. He said nothing about prison. The woman at the passenger desk, short and brown with a mole on the side of her nose, consulted with another man and another woman, made a phone call. Nope, that one's out. They just canceled it. Then she printed out another boarding card. This'll get you there, she told him. We'll call ahead to the gate and tell him you're coming. Shadow felt like a pea being flicked between 3 cups, and the card shuffled through a deck. Again, he ran through the airport, ending up near where he'd gotten off in the first place. A small man at the gate took his boarding pass. We've been waiting for you, he confided, tearing off the stub to the boarding pass with a Shadow seat assignment 17D on it. Shadow hurried onto the plane and they closed the door behind him. He walked through the first class. There were only 4 first-class seats, 3 of which were occupied. The bearded man in a pale suit seated next to the unoccupied seat at the very front grinned at Shadow as he got into the plane, then raised his wrist and tapped his watch as Shadow walked past. Yeah, I'm making you late, thought Shadow. Let that be the worst of your worries. The plane seemed pretty full as he made his way toward the back. Actually, Shadow discovered pretty quickly it was completely full. There was a middle-aged woman sitting in 17D. Shadow showed her his boarding card stub, and she showed him hers. They matched. Can you take your seat, please? Asked the flight attendant. No, he said. I'm afraid I can't. This lady is sitting in it. She clicked her tongue and checked their boarding cards. Then she led him up to the front of the plane and pointed to the empty seat in first class. Looks like today's your lucky day, she told him. Shadow sat down. Can I bring you something to drink? She asked. We'll just have time for one before takeoff. I'm sure you need one after that. I'd like a beer, please, said Shadow. Whatever you got. The flight attendant went away. The man in the pale suit sat beside Shadow, put out his arm and tapped his watch with his fingernail. It was a black Rolex. You're late, said the man as he grinned a huge grin with no warmth in it at all. Sorry? I said you're late. The flight attendant hurled Shadow a glass of beer. He sipped it. For a moment, he wondered if the man was crazy. Then he decided he must have been referring to the plane, waiting for the last passenger. Sorry if I held you up, he said politely. You in a hurry? The plane backed away from the gate. The flight attendant came back and took Shadow's beer half finished. The man in the pale suit grinned at her and said, Don't worry, I'll hold on to this tightly. As she let him keep his glass of Jack Daniels while protesting weakly that it violated airline regulations. Let me be the judge of that, my dear. Time is certainly of the essence, said the man, but no, I'm not in a hurry. I'm merely concerned that you will not make the plane. Well, that was kind of you. The plane sat restlessly on the ground, engines throbbing, aching to be taking off. Kind my ass, said the man in the pale suit. I've got a job for you, Shadow. A roar of engines, the little plane jerked forward into a takeoff, pushing Shadow back into his seat. Then they were airborne, and the airport lights were falling away behind them. Shadow looked at the man in the seat next to him. His hair was a reddish gray, his beard, little more than stubble, was grayish red. He was smaller than Shadow, but he seemed to take up a hell of a lot of room. A craggy, square face with pale gray eyes. The suit looked expensive, and it was the color of melted vanilla ice cream. His tie was a dark gray silk, and the tie pin was a tree, forked with the silver trunk branches and deep roots. He held his glass of Jack Daniels as he took off, and did not spill a single drop. Aren't you going to ask me what kind of job? How do you know who I am? Well, why not? Oh, it's the easiest thing in the world to know what people call themselves. A little thought, a little luck, a little memory. Ask me what kind of job. No. Why? I'm going home. I've got a job waiting for me there. I don't want any other job. The man's craggy smile did not change outwardly, but now he seemed actually amused. You don't have a job waiting for you at home. You have nothing waiting for you there. Meanwhile, I am offering you a perfectly legal job, Good money, limited security, remarkable fringe benefits. Hell, if you live that long, I could throw in a pension plan. You think maybe you'd like one of them? Shadow said, "You could have seen my name on my boarding pass or on the side of my bag." The man said nothing. "Whoever you are, you couldn't have known I was going to be on this plane. I didn't know I was going to be on this plane, and if my plane hadn't diverted to St. Louis, I wouldn't have been. My guess is you're a practical joker. Maybe you're hustling something, but maybe we'll have a better time if we end this conversation here." The man shrugged. Shadow picked up an in-flight magazine. The little plane jerked, bumped through the sky, making it louder to concentrate. The words floated through his mind like soap bubbles, there as he read them, gone completely a moment later. The man quietly in the seat beside him, sipping his Jack Daniels. His eyes were closed. Shadow read the list of in-flight music channels available on transatlantic flights, and then he was looking at the map of the world with red lines on it and showed where the airline flew. Then he had finished reading the magazine, and reluctantly he closed the cover and slipped into the pocket of the wall. The man opened his eyes. There was something strange about his eyes. Shadow thought one of them was a darker gray than the other. He looked at Shadow. "By the way," he said, "I was sorry to hear about your wife, Shadow. A great loss." "So was I." The man shook his head. "If it could have been any other way," he said inside. "She died in a car crash," said Shadow. "It was a fast way to go. Otherwise could have been worse." The man shook his head slowly. For a moment it seemed to Shadow if the man was insubstantial, as if the plane was suddenly becoming more real, while his neighbor had become less so. "Shadow, it's not a joke. It's not a trick. I can pay you better than any job you'll find will pay you. You're an ex-con. There's not a long line of people elbowing each other for their way to hire you." "Mr. Whoever the fuck you are," said Shadow, just loud enough to be heard over the din of the engines, "there isn't enough money in the world." The grin got bigger. Shadow found himself remembering a PBS show he had seen as a teenager about chimpanzees. The show claimed that when apes and chimps smile, it's only to bare their teeth in a grimace of hate or aggression or terror. When a chimp grins, it's a threat. This grin was one of those. "Sure, there's money enough. And there's also bonuses. Work for me and I'll tell you things. There may be a little risk, of course, but if you survive, you can have whatever your heart desires. You could be the next king of America. Now," said the man, "who else is going to pay you that well?" "Huh? Who are you?" asked Shadow. "Ah, yes, the age of information. Young lady, could you pour me another Jack Daniels, please? Easy on the ice. Not, of course, that there have ever been any kind of my age. Information and knowledge, these are currencies that have never gone out of style." "I said, who are you?" "Let's see. Well, seeing that today is certainly my day, why don't you call me Wednesday? Mr. Wednesday. Although given the weather, it might as well be Thursday, huh? What's your real name? Work for me long enough and well enough, and I may even tell you that. There, job offer. Think about it. No one expects you to say yes immediately, not knowing whether you're leaping into a piranha tank or a pit of bears. Take your time." He closed his eyes and leaned back in his seat. "I don't think so," said Shadow. "I don't like you. I don't want to work with you. Like I say, don't rush into it. Take your time." The plane landed with a bump and a few passengers got off. Shadow looked out the window and it was the little airport in the middle of nowhere, and there were still 2 little airports to go before Eagle Point. Shadow transferred his glance to the man in the pale suit. Mr. Wednesday? He seemed to be asleep. Shadow stood up, grabbed his bag, and slipped off the plane, down the steps and the slick, wet tarmac, walking at an even pace towards the lights of the terminal. A light rain spattered his face. Before he went inside the airport building, he stopped, turned, and watched. No one else had gotten off the plane. The ground crew rolled in steps away. The door was closed, and it taxied down the runway. Shadow stared at it until it took off. Then he walked inside to the budget car rental, the only one open, and he rented what turned out to be in the parking lot, a small red Toyota. Shadow unfolded the map he had been given. He spread it out on the passenger seat. Eagle Point was about 250 miles away, most of the journey on the freeway. He had not driven a car in 3 years. The storms had passed, if they had come this far. It was cold and clear. Clouds scudded in front of him like the moon, and for a moment Shadow could not be certain whether it was the clouds or the moon that was moving. He drove north for a half an hour and though. It was getting late. He was hungry. When he realized how hungry he really was, he pulled off the next exit and drove into the town of Nottaman, population 1,301. He filled the gas tank at the Imoko and asked the board woman at the cash register where the best bar in the area was, somewhere he could get something to eat. Jack's Crocodile Bar, she told him. It's west on County Road North. Crocodile Bar? Yeah, Jack says they had character, she said. She drew him a map on the back of a mauve flyer which advertised a chicken roast to raise money for a young girl who needed a new kidney. He's got a couple of crocodiles, a snake, one of those big lizard things. An iguana? That's him. Though the town, over a bridge for a couple of miles, and he stopped at a low, rectangular building with an illuminated Pabst sign and a Coca-Cola machine by the door. The parking lot was half empty. Shadow parked the red Toyota and went inside. The air was thick with smoke, and Walking In After Midnight was playing on the jukebox. Shadow looked around for the crocodiles, but he couldn't see any. He wondered if the woman at the gas station was pulling his leg. What'll it be? Asked the bartender. You, Jack? It's Jack's night off. I'm Paul. Hi, Paul. House beer and a hamburger with all the trimmings. No fries. Bowl of chili to start. Best chili in the state. Sounds good, said Shadow. Where's the restroom? The man pointed to the door of the bar. Around the corner, there was a stuffed alligator, head mounted on the door. Shadow went through the door. It was a clean, well-lit room. Shadow looked around the room first. Force a habit. Remember, Shadow, you can't fight back when you're pissing, low-key said, as low-key as always, in the back of his mind. He took the urinal stall to the left, then he unzipped his fly and pissed for an age, relaxing, feeling relief. He read the yelling pages clipping framed at eye level with a photo of Jack and two alligators. There was a polite grunt from the urinal immediately to his right, although he had heard nobody come inside. The man in the pale suit was bigger standing than he had seemed sitting on the plane beside Shadow. He was almost Shadow's height, and sitting on the plane beside Shadow. He was almost Shadow's height, and Shadow was a big man. He was staring ahead of him. He finished the pissing, took the last few drops, and zipped himself up. Then he grinned, like a fox eating shit from a barbed wire fence. So, said Mr. Wednesday, you've had time to think, Shadow. Do you want the job? End of chapter 1.